Welcome to this presentation on the must-have deliverables for Phase 1 and 2 of a process improvement project. What our goal is today, and the topics we'll be covering, first we want to take a review of some key background concepts for process improvement and the Rummler-Brache methodology, and set a context for what we view a project improvement project as, or PIP. PIP. Then we want to go over the key deliverables for Phase 1, 2A, and 2B of a process improvement project, and kind of review those, not just what they are, but why they're important and how they contribute to the overall success of a process improvement project. And finally, what are some of the critical success factors? I'll review that at the beginning of the presentation, or near the beginning, and then as I go over each phase and the deliverables, I'll read those critical success factors. So if you've ever watched one of our webinars before or attended some of our training or perhaps read through the website, you know that fundamental to our approach to process improvement is a recognition that any business, any organization, any enterprise is composed of three major components or levels. The first of these really is process, because that's the way people work together to deliver value to the customer. So no matter how big an organization is or how small, there are going to be processes. Sometimes these processes are mature, sometimes they're ad hoc, depends on the situation, but there's always a way of working, and that way of working can be changed to make improvements to the value delivered to the customer. Also important, of course, then, are the people that perform that process, what we call the performer level, but it's really the people level. And this is kind of the engine that delivers value to the customer. A lot of performance improvement, though, focuses on how people are organized within that same enterprise, and that's what we call the organization level. Ideally, the organization actually supports the value delivery, meaning that you're organized to support the process. So the organization level would provide priorities, resources, it would balance supply and demand, it would set strategy, and it would support the people in their delivery of the process. And so all those things work together. The importance of this to a process improvement project is that you may be addressing the problem as a people problem, you may be addressing it as a process problem or workflow problem, or you may be addressing it as an organizational structure problem. But at whatever level you're focusing, there are impacts on the other levels. And so what we try to do with our methodology and toolkit is build in an awareness and attention to all three levels as you create the change you want to implement, so that there aren't unintended consequences. Along with the three levels, there are three needs for good performance at any of those levels, whether you're designing a process, a job, or a role, or an organization. And these are goals, so that's about where you're going, what's important, why. Design, which is what a lot of methodologies tend to focus on, you know, how many steps in the process? What does this job look like? What are the skills required? It's kind of about what we want the process to be, or what we want the job or organization to be. And finally, but certainly in some way importantly, management. This is the continual monitoring and adaptation of the design to achieve the goals. And all this works together. In between these three needs, you have a couple of things going on as well. One is translation. So a lot of what a process improvement project should do is translate goals into design. And then finally, implementation, because a good process design isn't worth much if it isn't adopted by the users. And a lot of what our methodology and toolkit seeks to do is increase the chances that people are going to develop new work habits around your new process design. So getting to a good design is one thing. Getting people to align and execute a new process design is something else entirely, and something that is really important if we're to get the kind of performance change we want. So our framework or methodology for delivering this has basically 5 phases. The first phase essentially is what we call phase 0, is to assess the organization, that entire enterprise, a collection of processes and people, if you will, and look for areas that need the most attention. And this is going to be based both on the strategy of the organization, where does it want to go, where does it need to be, and its current situation, internally and externally, what we would call the environmental data. That allows you to select processes that need improvement versus processes that perhaps are good enough for now. And so the top piece, the piece about assessing and monitoring how things are working, is what we'll call process management. The bottom piece is what we'll call process improvement, and that's where we get our process improvement projects. And for this presentation, I'm going to mainly focus on the define and develop phases of the process improvement project. Implementation, obviously critically important. Adoption is key if you're going to get the performance improvements. It's actually the important thing. But I wanted to review kind of first principles, what happens in the define and develop stage for this webinar. So, what are the success factors, or excuse me, what are some of the scopes of process improvement effort? We have what we call simple, and if you look at this model, the cylinders are supposed to represent organizational silos, if you will, collections of people reporting to a single manager. If you have a problem that's confined to a work group, we'll call that a simple process improvement effort. That's not really what we would call a process improvement in our terminology. That's fixing something that's broken inside a process. So the process itself may not be broken, it just needs to be repaired. The effects of changing that process are local. That's typically handled with your analyst toolkit, things that you might get from the Six Sigma toolkit, for example, Pareto analysis, root cause analysis, that type of thing. But when we get to larger processes that cross more boundaries, organizational boundaries or role boundaries, we get into what we call an intermediate process project. This is a process improvement project that's going to require some recognition of upstream and downstream handoffs, that white space between organizations. And that's where a lot of your improvement is, and understanding those upstream and downstream flows will be essential. Finally, and most typically for a Rummler-Brache process improvement project, we're talking about complex processes, not in terms of what the process is supposed to achieve or how it's designed, but in terms of how many people are involved. So the more organizations that are involved in a cross-functional process, the more difficult it is to assess, the more difficult it is to design, and certainly the more difficult it is to change, because you've got to align all of those participants in creating and implementing the solution. Which brings me to the critical, to the timeline of something of this nature. We're talking anywhere from 10 to 20 weeks, depending on the scope of a project. So if you're doing something that's a major overhaul of a petrochemical company's supply chain, that's a very large process. That's going to take several weeks, if not months, to get to the recommendation stage, and then the implementation cycle could take many months beyond that. If, however, you're perhaps in a situation where you're managing repair technicians, for example, the process is cross-functional but relatively self-contained, then you can go in a much shorter cycle. So whether it's a long or short project will depend upon the number of people involved, so how many functions are involved, the cycle time or nature of the process. Highly transactional processes are usually easier to work on than more long cycle processes like complex project management or complex product development. And then sort of the nature of the process. Is it a manufacturing, logistics, service type process, or is it more of a people and judgment-based process like business development, product development, marketing, that type of thing. In general, when we say process improvement project for Rummler Brache, we're talking cross-functional, and we're talking something of significance, of great significance to either internal or external customers. And so to give you an idea of the scope of these things. So to be successful, here are some of the elements that need to be in place, and then we'll just talk about how these are supported with the tools. You need focus, and that means things are visible, they're clear. So from everything from your scoping to your mapping requires a good deal of focus, and that's part of what you can bring if you're a facilitator or an analyst assisting with the project. Engagement, this is key. Without engagement, there's no ownership. And so the way you interact with the people who are going to change is absolutely essential. We tend to use cross-functional teams to develop their own process. But even if you're designing a process for someone, having an approach that leads to engagement of the affected stakeholders is essential. You're not going to get change without it. Alignment, obviously, you've got to make sure that everyone's on the same page through consensus, common understanding of the problem, and ultimately collaboration, especially during implementation. And finally, persistence. And this gets to, planning, commitment, and follow-through. Now let's talk about the deliverables. Now, the way I'm going to describe these deliverables, we're going to go pretty fast through this because I think there's about 20 of them. But I want you to understand that it's not the template or the map or the example that's important in this discussion. It's the way these things work together. And so while the complexity of the deliverable might change, the physical deliverable, the documented deliverable, the essential need for it does not change depending on scope. So a small project and a large project both would need these deliverables. What would change is the amount of effort required to get there and the amount of analysis. Let's start with the define phase where you're trying to understand what it is you're working on and why. I'll go through these quickly on this table, and then we'll get to them, some examples of some of these. Number one is case for change. This is the first error people make on process improvement projects. They'll go into a process improvement project because someone wants a process improvement project, or someone has started an initiative to document processes. The best way to get engagement, alignment, and adoption of solutions is to make sure there is a compelling reason for people to change, and that starts with this critical business issue. Stated simply, it's why you're spending time on this process and why now, and why not on something else. And so it requires a connection to the overall business's ability to survive or thrive. So if it's something that if it's not fixed, is going to threaten your top line or your bottom line, that's a critical business issue. If it's something that threatens your ability to execute an important strategy, that's a critical business issue. It becomes the basis for communication and change management during implementation, but it also provides focus for the team. Critical process issues are really the case for why the process will help address the critical business issue. Goals are measurable aspects of the process that you've targeted. So now that you know why you're working on the process, what about it are you going to change? Sort of the performance gaps, almost always expressed as results measures at this stage rather than upstream measures. So these are things like cycle time, quality, those types of things. What we call a process profile, which is really the boundaries of the process, the definition of the process, and the value of the process described, so that everyone can understand it. You may have heard of the SIPOC model with customer, suppliers, and process. It's essentially a visual version of that. You won't be successful in any process improvement without that kind of really simple, precise, complete scope of the process so that everybody's on the same page as to what's in and what's out. The last two things are really specific to Rummler Brache. One is called process relationships. Stated simply, garbage in, garbage out. This is looking upstream and downstream in the process to make sure you understand impacts outside of your scope. And this will be important later during implementation and also to manage expectations about changes. And finally, function relationships is understanding that organization level. Who are the participants in the process? How do they participate? let's take a quick tour through some of these. First, I want to talk about the why part of it. Let's assume that there was a pizza company named Uncle Enzo's that did mostly delivery pizza, maybe with some carry-out and some dine-in. For them, a critical business issue is stated here as losing 12% of the home delivery market to new competitors, even if as the overall market is increasing. So this does not show up in their revenue yet because they're still selling pizzas because the market is bigger. Maybe it's because of the recession. But their share of that has decreased. And if they don't fix it, their public revenue targets to Wall Street are at risk. That's a good critical business issue. It states what the problem is, why it threatens the business, and what's going to happen if you don't fix it. That's the kind of thing that every process improvement project should have. It's called the reason for improvement, but also the reason for action. Here to the right, you have some critical process. Let me show them with the pointer. The one that we might be focusing on for the rest of this example is this one. There are the critical process issues. So this is a way of linking this process to this issue and saying if we solve late deliveries and incorrect orders, we may be helping with the market share. They have some evidence that there's a link there. And finally, there are some quantifiable goals. All right. These elements are all necessary at the beginning of scoping a process improvement project. Once you have that, so you've selected a process, you're going to need to do a profile. I'm not going to go through all this, but I will tell you what the anatomy of the process is. It's basically, you're going to need to know what the output is, who values it, and why. It's essential to define the value of the output, not just the output. Okay, because to understand the value of the process is going to put the right perspective on redesigning it. We see a lot of mistakes in defining the value. There's a business development project I worked on last year, and they called it proposal development process. They changed it to solution development process because the value of the process wasn't that they got a proposal out to their customers on time. The value of the process was that it communicated their capabilities to the customers in a competitive bid. And so they need to focus on the customer and the solution more than the proposal itself. It wasn't just about putting a document together. It was about getting people aligned to demonstrate capability. So understanding that value is key. And then, of course, once you've got the customer, the outputs and the value, you're going to be looking at inputs. You're going to be looking at your triggers, very important. And you're going to be looking at some of the key activities or sub-processes inside of that. So, for example, on our pizza example, we're looking at pizza delivery. The value is providing the pizza to the customer on time, what they wanted. The sub-processes might be take it, make it, bake it, and deliver it. And this gives a framework for getting more detail during the next phase, which is analysis. Now, process relationship maps are a little different. They're going to take a single process. So for our pizza delivery example, we might be looking, for instance, at just a delivery piece. And we're going to look at upstream and downstream connections to other processes in the business. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, oh, this is a model of the enterprise architecture, how everything fits together. Yeah, it could have value as that, and it often will eventually turn into a model of how the whole enterprise works. But for you, working on a process improvement project, the really important thing is pretty simple and pretty mundane. You need to know what is coming in the process that may be affecting its performance. Maybe you're getting bad forecast data. Maybe the suppliers aren't getting materials to your fulfillment process in time. Maybe the inventory is inaccurate. And you need to know what you're providing to other processes that could be of consequence to their performance, because those connections to those other processes will be part of what you need to address in your improvement effort. It's really essential, and it also is going to help manage expectations about what gets changed. You may be able to improve the delivery process to where it's the fastest in the business, but if your cheese isn't there when you need it, it doesn't matter. So it's really about understanding those external consequences and scoping those into the project appropriately. There's a generic example. Don't have time to go through all of it, but essentially each box on this is a self-contained process that could be broken down into a detailed workflow. Finally, we also look at function relationship maps. It looks a lot like the process relationship, but let's turn things on their head. This is not processes, but groups of people, organizations, departments, if you will. You could almost take the org chart of the organization, cut it into pieces, and then draw lines representing their relationships. What are the inputs and outputs they require from each other in order to execute the business? When you do this, you'll have a good idea of which functions would participate in a specific process. If you were to trace a specific process flow through the org chart, who handles it first, who handles it second, that type of thing at a high level, that's going to allow you to get the right people involved in analysis and design. Okay, so that's the define phase. Let's talk about the analysis phase. This is where you discover what the current workflow is. Absolutely essential, even if you've been given a charge to completely redesign everything and start with a blank page, the process as it currently exists is in place. That's the habits people have. If process is the way people work together, you must understand it in order to implement something new. There's no skipping is, ever, unless you don't have an is process. If it's a brand new process, you could skip it. But if there's already an is process, you're going to need to do some analysis on it. The key deliverables here are pretty simple. You've got the map. You've got disconnects, which are in a way little problem statements about where the breakdowns occur in the process. You have specs for the to-be process or should process that are almost really a scope for the design in the next phase. And then at option, I wouldn't call this a must-have deliverable, but it's very, very nice to have. You have some could-be concepts about some directions the design could take. They're not designs, they're not commitments, but they are ways of getting people to think differently about the process, and they may be able to leverage those exercises when they build their should process in the next phase. So what's a cross-functional map? Many of you may be familiar with this. The value of it is you're looking at how that process navigates its way through the different functions or roles. And it should be quite obvious that the more handoffs you have, the more complicated this map is going to be. And of course that has implications on performance. So if you're assessing a change to a cross-functional process, it is absolutely critical to understand where these handoffs are. And that's what's going to drive your investigation process. You can do interviews, you can do observation, but you want to get the process as it is, not as people think it ought to be, not as it was previously documented, as it actually occurs today, tomorrow, and the next day. So you're going to be doing some direct observation of the process or some direct information collecting. This is essential because it's important to know what the reality is when you get into implementation and look at the gap between the should and the is. Next, we have an example of a cross-functional map. For the pizza, for example, a phone call comes in, they record the order, they read it back to the customer. If it's confirmed, they fill out a paper ticket, et cetera, and so forth. This is kind of the level of detail we'd be looking at. Disconnects are something you get when you validate the process with a group of process users, and they're little problems or breakdowns that occur in the process. For example, and this is the standard format, you're going to look at the effect and the impact. Orders draw the contact number for the customer. So you have sort of a problem statement somewhere in the process, and then you're going to look at the impact. Drivers waste time trying to find difficult addresses, missed or delayed deliveries. So it's important to be specific and as realistic as possible in these statements. What these are used for is a couple of things. One, it gets people engaged. I said engagement was very important. This is getting people that actually work in the process engaged in solving the problem is essential to your implementation later on. And this is a very engaging technique to get people to describe problems as they see them, as they experience in them. And then as a group, they prioritize. So even though you will get some pet peeves and some things thrown out here that may represent, once-in-a-lifetime events, they begin to feel ownership of the problem, and as a group, they're going to give you the right priorities on these. So engagement is one goal. The next goal is for focus, because what's going to happen is these are going to be prioritized, and you're going to focus on those disconnects that have the most impact on your project goals. So if it was speed of delivery, the focus will float to the top, and when you build your new process, you're going to test against these disconnects to see if you've eliminated or reduced their impact. It's that simple. Specifications are sort of the flip side. If disconnects is what you don't want to do, specifications is what you do need to achieve with the process. It goes beyond the goals of the process. You may have been given goals on cycle time or quality, and gets specific, so it's even more focused, as I said. You're focusing down on what does this process do, what are the elements that need to be in place in the new process, what are my assumptions about how it's operating. And this is done for the whole process first, so at a high level. And this is something that's very important when you're dealing with your management or steering team, so they understand and agree and align, there's your alignment, with those requirements. So the team is committing to build a process that meets these requirements, or attempt to build a process that meets those requirements. And that's what a should spec is. Finally, a could-be concept is a sort of a breakout brainstorming. It's almost a Pictionary thing where people come up with solutions. Some of them may be for a part of the process, some of them may be a whole concept. This is one that actually came from an actual training class on the pizza case study, and someone said we can address some of our issues by combining the assembly process with the order-taking process. Let's do them in parallel. And we can do that with headsets and reconfiguring the workspace. We can cross-train people so that we can handle peaks by taking some of the bakers and make them order takers / preparers, et cetera, and so forth. And so they would go through, describe this, state the benefits, state the risk, state some assumptions, and that information will ensure that they're thinking about the process from a big picture standpoint before they go in and build a new workflow. Some of these concepts could be endorsed as a template for design. Others may simply be give useful ideas that could be applied on a smaller scale to the design. Depends on the scope of the effort and the size of the performance gap. Now we get to should. So we know what we don't want to do. We know what we do want to do. We know the scope of the process. We know the current workflow. We need to have a few things. First, we're going to revisit our process profile and make sure it's still valid. We're going to build a metrics chain so that we can manage the process during implementation and beyond. During implementation is key because you want to troubleshoot the changes that you're putting into place. You're going to see a decline in performance initially as people deal with the changes and as you debug some of the processes during piloting or implementation. But ultimately, you want the process to be managed for the future. Future process improvement efforts will take less time, less effort, and be backed up with good data. You'll have your new workflow maps and a few new things. You'll have roles and responsibilities. This is getting down to that people level. You need to know who does what when and how that's going to change. You're going to have some recommendations, which are essentially statements of work. A lot of people skip this. They get to the point where they have a new process map. This is one of the worst errors to make in a process improvement project, and think that the map is a deliverable. It is not. The deliverable are the changes that you're going to implement in the next phase. Those changes need to be described such that they can be understood in context of the process map, but also in context of the activity required to support them, and I'll show you an example in a moment. And the people side also needs to be understood because you need to know what new work habits are people going to have to establish for that process to work, and what habits are they going to have to give up. And that requires going through the roles and responsibilities in some detail. And finally, you'll need an implementation strategy that considers the nature of the change and how it impacts different stakeholder groups. And this would all inform your project plan as you go into implementation. The basic approach is start again with the big picture. What's our pizza delivery process? What are the sub-processes? Have we changed our thinking on that as a result of going through the IS analysis? We did the requirements for the whole process. We're going to be looking at the requirements for our sub-processes before we begin detailed design. And then, independent of any roles, this is very important, you're going to build the workflow. We call that the linear workflow, although it's not necessarily sequential. There could be a great deal of parallel path in the process, but what you don't want is to talk about roles initially, because you want to get to the essence of the process. As I said earlier, once you get cross-functional, you're introducing complexity into the process. If you start with a cross-functional process in the is, you're going to have a cross-functional process in the should, but the handoffs may be different, role, scope of work may be different, and that may be part of the advantage or improvement that you expect. A lot of times what people do is reduce handoffs, broaden job content, etc., something we can cover in a future webinar. So reminding you what we did in the is we did requirements for the overall process. What we'll do in the should is we'll do that for each individual sub-process. We will create a metrics chain, so we'll start with our external metrics, and then we'll decide or develop metrics upstream that support those external metrics. Now, on this list, there's 30 or 40 potential metrics. What we do during the is focus. We're going to focus on probably no more than about 6 of those to start with, and then as the organization learns how this process behaves and where they need to measure to troubleshoot and manage the process, they may add metrics as the process matures. But this is the tool that we can use to get that initial list, and then we have some techniques for prioritizing. I'm going to go pretty quickly through the linear map. It's just developing some detail. At the end of it, you'll be doing a test. When you've got your map, you're going to test the sequence. Is it logical? Normally this is done with sample transactions from the past, and you walk through the process almost like what you would call in IT circles a conference room pilot. You're seeing what would work. Is it complete? And the 2 deliverables we had in the is, did I meet the should specifications? If not, is it good enough to go forward, or do I need to go back and change something about this workflow, or perhaps methods? And have I addressed the key disconnects? If you can answer those questions, all those questions is yes, you've probably got your final map, so to speak. And then what you're going to do is decide who does what. Now you know what needs to be done and why, and you feel confident about it. You start reassigning these work steps to the different roles. And what you'll get is a deliverable that has steps versus functions. These could be roles. These could be functions and roles, depending on the level of detail needed for implementation. And then you're going to decide how they participate. We have a model called PARIS, or some people call it pairs. It's similar to RACI. I'll go over it in the next slide. But more important than that single letter is the actual task level description. You want some detail. This becomes invaluable when we, in implementation, do training, job aids, documentation, job design. You may be changing a job description. You want to know what this job or this function is accountable for, and your accountability model is right there in detail. Imagine if you just had the P or the A. What you're looking for is the detailed description. As far as the acronym, what we have is PARIS, performer. That's the only one that's required. That's who's actually doing the work. That's what shows up on your cross-functional map. What doesn't show up on your cross-functional map, but is equally important, is input. So which functions or roles provide input that is essential to the execution of that step. For example, if I'm making a promise to the pizza customer on delivery time, it's essential that someone else is updating data on site, so I have that data if we designed it that way. Otherwise, I'm just guessing, right? If I'm promising a delivery date and I'm Amazon order fulfillment, it's essential. I may be the performer in the order taking piece, but it's essential that the people in inventory update their inventory as soon as they pick it. So that's what we're talking about. Approval are hard stops on the process, so any actual approvals should be rare, but there are places in the process where you stop and make a qualified decision with clear criteria that are repeatable from individual to individual so that it's not just a guess. And then finally, review is who needs to know that the step has been completed. Sometimes this is reporting, but even more important, you're triggering other processes. So you may be out of order fulfillment triggering billing, or you might be triggering a reorder in inventory. So it's understanding that. And finally, support. Some steps are complex and they require additional performers. You would identify the lead performer on the map, but you would also need to say who else could be involved. Finally, there are recommendations. We're getting close to the end of our time, so I'll try to go over this quickly. These are 1 or 2 page statements of work for the major changes for the process. So, for example, in our pizza example, we may have a recommendation to create a new role called the preparer or order preparer, and it's a role that combines 2 previous roles. That's going to need to be described. You're going to understand the cost involved in that. Training would be an obvious one, but there might be activities around reclassifying the job. It may even require compensation changes. That's the type of thing you would be looking into. System changes, equipment upgrades, moving people, those types of things need to all be described. Anything that's required to make the process work. And finally, we want to do a bit of strategizing around the process. Our basic model for that is to look at the resistance to the change. In other words, how people will feel about the change based on their role and their involvement in the process versus how disruptive the actual installation will be. So, for example, you might feel really good about having a new traffic bypass built around your neighborhood so your commute time is reduced. But during the actual construction, you're going to have delays, you're going to have noise, and so those types of things disrupt the day-to-day life during the implementation. And so you balance those 2 things out for some different approaches. So I won't go into each quadrant, but there are different tactics for communication, training, and change management associated with each of these, something we cover in our training. And this is really focused on getting your adoption rate very high for the new process. Okay, and finally, of course, you'd have implementation plan. Again, you're not a project manager in doing the phase 1 and phase 2 of the PIP. What you're doing is describing at a high level the major changes or recommendations, the overall sequence of events, and kind of a level of effort estimate on the budget and the timing. In the implementation phase is where a project manager or the project manager for the process improvement project would provide a detailed plan, something that had perhaps a Gantt chart or some other way of communicating what needs to be done to implement the process. All right, so those are in a very quick amount of time. Those are the major deliverables for a cross-functional process improvement project. If anyone wants to ask questions, we can entertain those for another 5 minutes or so. If you have questions and want to follow up by email later, that's also fine. John, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Very good. I do have one question that does your Rumler-Brace framework address the knowledge overlay for process improvement efforts? And by knowledge overlay, how do you capture the process knowledge in addition to improvement of the process?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I'm thinking
exactly what's meant by knowledge. There's a good deal of if you're talking about institutional knowledge of the people executing the process, that's captured through analyzing, developing the process with teams. If you're talking about information, because to me knowledge implies a human, information is more abstract. Information and data required to support the process, that's a major component of the scoping and also the development. So, for instance, a lot of processes, especially service processes, are information intensive and knowledge intensive and may involve the use of one or more systems. We definitely focus on that aspect. You know, what information is needed to execute the work steps, what information is created during the work steps. And this becomes critical. The timing of of creating information to support the workflow is something that's often broken in the process. It's a major disconnect category we see. So that type of knowledge management, yes, is included within development of the models and the recommendations. But there's another type of knowledge that's more people-driven. It's institutional knowledge, cultural knowledge, that type of thing. We capture that in the implementation planning and strategy when we think about what do people, their culture, what do they know about the stakeholder groups and how they're likely to react to changes. And we use that knowledge to adjust our implementation plan and perhaps even the process design. So I hope that addressed the question. There's another one about which phase 1, 2A, or 2B require more effort and challenges to the PIP team. One can cause lots of problems if it's not done well, but typically in our model, one is mostly the facilitator or process improvement specialist, gathering this information from the sponsor and what we call the steering team, which would be the people at the management or executive level that are involved in those functions. And so you kind of learn that as you scope. I find that once you learn our toolkit, that part is probably the best thing, the easiest learning curve. 2A is quite easy. If you're good at mapping workflow and you're good at listening and observing, 2A is also not that difficult. What is difficult is 2B because, first of all, it doesn't exist. Second, people will be more than happy to tell you what's wrong with the existing process and more than happy to recommend changes when they don't realize it's real. As you get closer to presenting something to a team that's going to sponsor it and provide resources and challenge your rationale, people have mental blocks, or it's just not in their nature. You never. It's harder to put on your project calendar. Normally, I hold about 4 should development sessions, but again, you never know what you're going to get into. You might get in there, you might decide you want to change something and realize there's all these connections, which is why I did that in scoping. So 2B is definitely the hardest. And of course, implementation is the most difficult for the organization. And that's why we spend a lot of time thinking about engaging the design team, engaging the stakeholders, assessing the change management before we even propose the detailed implementation plan. Another question is, how large should the PIP team and the required skills needed? Very good question. In terms of group management, if you get, you can manage a team of a dozen, but really it's the ideal size is somewhere around 8. Now, and I'm assuming part of the issue is if you've got 20 different work groups involved in a large cross-functional process, they all need to feel ownership and involvement in that, or you're going to have problems during implementation. So, and you may miss something. So one technique is to, if you've got just a really, really cross-functional process, is you get a core team of people from those functions that are most involved. So you would have learned that during your scoping, that 80% of the process is in these 5 functions. And and as far as requirements, you're going to get the people that understand the work as it is currently performed. So there's a tendency to pick managers that had 20 years experience, but they're doing something else now. That's usually a bad decision. Not because they don't participate well in the team, but because they don't have recent hands-on knowledge. And so you want to get people that really experience that process day to day, people that can work on a team with your help, and people that are willing to have a fairly open mind. But I've had teams be successful with a couple of people that are set in their ways, and they were there to act almost as a honesty check on the rest of the team when they were proposing changes. When you do have a situation where you can't involve all of the departments or functions involved, you'll need to set your project plan up so that you can have stakeholder reviews of those other people. So, for instance, the team may create their is analysis and do their disconnects. You're going to have to invite the 12 groups that weren't involved to provide their input, but it's more limited. You're spending less time, and it's more of it's almost like a focus group, a couple of hours versus a day or two. So that's how you could handle that. Any other questions?
No, Dave, I think we've covered all of them, and we can certainly address any other ones that you think of later on. Just send us an email and be happy to address them. Anyway, thanks everyone for attending this morning, and we appreciate your involvement and look forward to joining you in another webinar next month. Thanks so much.
John, I've got one more thing that we should probably add. A little later on our website, I think we're going to have a list of topics for upcoming webinars, and encourage people to go back and look at that and go ahead and sign up for the ones you're interested in.
Very good. Thanks again. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.